Welcome. I am Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSE as part of ASEB's Professional Development webinar series. Today, our facilitator, Dr. Sarah Brownell, will be introducing our featured author for this installment of Online with LSE. Sarah, you can turn on your camera now.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this LSE Online. Today I'm really excited for what we have in store for you. For those of you who have not been to one of these sessions before, it's essentially a behind the scenes look at a paper that's been published in LSE. And so today, Dr. Paul Lee will be talking about his paper on investigating undergraduate biology student science identity production. We will be using the Q&A feature to collect questions along the way. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So as I turn things over to Dr. Lee, please feel free to go ahead and add questions as they come up using the Q&A feature. Paul, we'll go ahead and have you turn on your video and PowerPoint now.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sarah, and thank you everyone for being in attendance today. So I wanted to start off this webinar with a brief 5-minute overview of my paper before we dive into the behind the scenes and answer some questions. And I wanted to start off by briefly thinking about what identity is. So whenever the term identity is mentioned or used, some of the terms that you see here on the left-hand side may be ways in which you think about it. So your race, ethnicity, the histories of your family and the communities that you come from. So as you can see here, it's pretty complex, and there are different ways in which we can define identity and what it is. G's definition is typically the one that we use, which is being recognized as a certain kind of person in a given context. And then there's been developments and evolutions of the term. Specifically, I pull a quote here from Nasir and Sachs that mentions that identities are not located solely in the individual, but rather are negotiated in social interactions that take form in cultural spaces. So what this does is it gives us the recognition that identities go beyond the labels that people may place on themselves or others, and that identities are also formed in the environments in which we live in and the people that we interact with, and the histories in which our communities share and have. The last bullet point that I wanted to mention here regarding identity is that historical and social systems undergird cultural spaces, and that's going to affect how we make meaning. So of the different socially constructed identities that we think about, race, ethnicity, and gender, for example, our experiences and our perceptions are going to be impacted by these socially constructed identities due to what has happened historically and what's happening at that moment culturally. So the paper that we're discussing today, the Investigating Student Science Identity Production paper, conceptualizes identities via two different avenues: conceptual identity production and procedural identity production. And whenever we talk about conceptual identity production, this is really the mental self-making, mental and emotional self-making process, where individuals make sense of who they are and who they want to be. And based off of how they perceive their experiences that's happened throughout their lives, they're really going to be able to mold this sense of self in terms of who they are at that moment and what's going to be possible. In addition to this mental and emotional self-making process, we also describe what is referred to as procedural identity production, which is referred to as the performance or the practice of an identity. So whenever you're part of any type of community, there's going to be some type of sociocultural participation where you're engaging with the artifacts that happen to be in a community. So for example, in a classroom, engaging with worksheets, different types of assessments, and other students. And the responses that you get from other individuals within that community is going to impact your identity production. So the goal of this paper was to start to conceptualize the ways in which identity production happens within undergraduate biology classrooms. In terms of the methods of this paper, this was given at a Mountain West institution between 2017 and 2018, and we utilized 5 introductory biology classrooms over those 2 years. Students were given a survey called the Classroom Community Scale in order for us to get a snapshot at their experiences, whether or not they felt a sense of belonging, whether or not they felt they had the opportunity to authentically interact and engage with the material and with their classmates. And from the Classroom Community Scale, we chose a subset of students to request interviews with, and we ended up getting 26 individuals for this particular study. We started off with a card sort activity, and you can see 2 examples here on the right-hand side where students are given pre-written cards and blank cards for them to write down any identities that were important to them. And we had them rank these identities from most important to them at that moment to least important to them, and engaged with questions on why they ranked certain identities before others. After this card sort activity, we dived into a semi-structured interview that discussed past experiences that students had with science, classroom experiences that they currently had in the particular context we were studying, and any feedback or recommendations that they had based off of what they've experienced as a student. After we were done with these interviews, we coded them using a framework that focused on conceptual identity production, so that mental and emotional self-making process that students engage in, as well as their procedural identity production, looking at the ways in which they may participate or engage in a classroom in order to have a better sense of the types of science identities that students were producing in these classroom contexts. In terms of the conclusions, what we wrote was that science identity production is multifaceted and complex. So each individual, of course, has their own histories, their own experiences that are going to impact the ways in which they participate in the classroom, and and how they feel like they belong in a classroom. We particularly focus on the roles of authoring, which is where students are constantly engaging with what's happening to them, and their perceptions are going to really impact who they think they are, how they feel like they fit in the classroom, and the short-term and long-term goals that they end up creating for themselves while they're at their institution. In addition, we also wanted to recognize the role of recognition in our study, where there are ways in which students may validate themselves as individuals within the science community, seeing that they are able to engage well with the worksheets, are able to converse with students, so being able to see yourself as a science person. And in addition, we also recognized recognition from the sense of validation from others. So a lot of our students mentioned in their small groups and in their communities that being affirmed as a science person by their instructor, or by any types of supplemental support and students, really helped them in their production of a science identity. So that is my quick overview. I apologize. That is my quick overview of our paper, and I'd like to go ahead and hand it back to Sarah.
Great, thank you. So we want to open up the floor for questions. So all of you should, at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, see the Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be able to write in your question. And the goal of this is to basically get to know what inspired Paul to do this study. What were some decision points along the way, how we might interpret this work, how it might be relevant for teaching and learning, et cetera. So while we wait for questions to roll in, I'll go ahead and start off with some questions. So science is often assumed to be devoid of identity, right? And obviously this is incorrect, but that's often an assumption that people make. Can you explain how your study helps support the assertion that the identities of those who do science and who see themselves as being able to do science is important?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for that question. So I agree with you. I think whenever people think of science, they think of objectivity, and they somehow make it analogous to thinking that that means that it's acultural, meaning that it doesn't have a culture. And what I remind individuals is that science does have a culture because we have our own established norms and values in terms of how we engage with the material and how we engage with each other, and even how we share our results of our studies if you look at the publication process. So because we do have established norms and established values and the ways in which we interact with one another, the socially constructed identities that people have, such as race, gender, etc., it can impact how we end up perceiving our experiences. Do the norms and values, for example, say that people of our identities belong, or are we more on the periphery? And due to this, it's going to impact the way in which we navigate these different types of science spaces.
So can you give us some specific examples from your paper with students of different identities, how they might have had a very different experience in terms of constructing their science identity?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So one of the ones that comes to mind is a student from South Africa that we interviewed in our study. His name was Isaac, and he really explicitly talked about how he knew that the way he looked is going to impact the way he and his group members would interact with him. And one of the frustrations that he brought up was he felt as though he was being diminished during group work, feeling as if his contributions weren't being as valued as other group members. And he attributed it to how he looked, so the first impressions that people got from him.
Mm-hmm. I have a question also about your kind of methodology. So you chose to use both card sorting and semi-structured interviews. And can you speak to why you and your author team decided to do that approach as opposed to giving students surveys or as opposed to doing some other type of methodology?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why we use the card sorting activity is, as we talked about earlier, identity is a complex construct. And from preliminary interviews that we did with students, we realized that if we just jump into the questions, that students really had a hard time with associating who they are with how they experience a classroom and the classroom experiences that they perceived. So that's one of the reasons why we added the card sort activity. Was it was a way for students to really think about who they are and get themselves into that identity mindset, so that they had so that whenever we did ask them questions about who they are, how they experience the classroom, they already had that connection, and it made it easier for them to go through the questions and need less clarification. In terms of the semi-structured interviews, one of the reasons why we did it is as students go through their experiences and tell their stories, we wanted to make sure that we provided opportunities to get the entirety of it. So if students ended up deviating a little bit, going down a different avenue that we may not have thought of, but was meaningful to them, we wanted to make sure to give them the opportunity and the space to share those experiences with us.
Yeah, so a follow-up question about those interviews. Did you do kind of practice interviews or preliminary interviews before the official interviews with students? And if so, did you change things about the questions? How did you make decisions about how those interview questions might have changed?
Yeah, so before the 26 students that were a part of the paper, we did preliminary interviews with 6 students using a very similar interview structure without the card sort activity. So from those 6 interviews, at the end of those, I actually asked the students what questions worked for you, what questions were a little bit confusing to you, how do you think we should reword it to make it clearer to other individuals. And from the feedback that the students gave, the author team, we went back through and decided to modify things based off of student suggestions. And that's how we ended up getting the final interview questions that we used for the 26 students in the study.
And did you use the same interview questions for all 26 students in the study?
Yeah, we did. So in our interview, which is in the supplemental materials, you'll see that there are primary questions that we ask of every student, and underneath them are supplementary questions, just because sometimes students may get confused and they need examples or they need clarification. So we have secondary questions in there as well in order to help engage students or to help elicit responses that may be just a little bit more richer.
A common question that gets brought up when people are doing interview studies is how many students is enough to interview? And if you see in the reported literature, sometimes a study will just interview 2 students versus a study might interview 70 students. So how did you land on 26 students, and how do you know it's enough students to draw some of the conclusions that you're drawing?
Yeah, so well, one of the terms that is used in qualitative methodologies is saturation, which is where you interview students, and eventually you'll get to the point where you start seeing recurring themes, students saying the same things again, and that's usually a pretty good indicator that at that point you've hit a great deal of the variety of experiences that students are going to share about a particular classroom context. I also want to recognize, though, that with qualitative interview studies, that it is going to be context dependent. So the students at the institution where we did our study, for example, that institution has its own culture, has its own histories based off of the communities that surround it. So because of that, another institution who may take the same interview protocol may need to do more. You may have a more diverse student population. You may have more students internationally that come into that institution. So it really is dependent on the type of institution that is part of the study.
So related to that, we had a question come in. So I'm assuming those 6 students that you interviewed for the preliminary interviews were also from the same institution. How did you pick those students?
Yeah, so those students were actually picked from a larger grant. So this study comes from a larger learning assistance grant, and we were already doing interviews for other portions of the larger project. So I'd say about 4 of those students were learning assistants already, 2 weren't, but we were doing additional studies on learning assistants and what they were doing in the classrooms and their identities. So I thought that I double dipped. I asked them to go through my interview protocols, and we used that as an opportunity to talk to them about their experiences and what they would change in the final iteration of that interview protocol.
Great. So I want to go back to that idea of context. So you talked about this study was done in the Mountain West, and what kind of institution was it done at?
So this was done at an urban institution in the Mountain West region. So because it was an urban institution, we at the time of the study, it was about 56% white students and 44% students of color, with the majority of that being Hispanic students.
Okay, so we had a question come in thinking about, so now you're teaching at a community college, and there was a question of to what extent do you think the results that you found at that institution might actually translate to the community college, and or what could community college instructors think about from your study?
Yeah, so well, the community college that I'm at feeds into that institution. So I know that the student demographics are going to be fairly similar to one another. In terms of the study and its applicability to different types of contexts, I do feel that some of the findings or some of the recommendations that we have do transcend the particular context whenever we think about, for example, the role of authoring that I talked about in the conclusions. The humans naturally create stories and do storytelling to help share our experiences. So by recognizing what students are saying, what students are experiencing as a story, as they're constructing that narrative, I think that that's something that can be taken to other institutions and other types and other contexts that may be different from ours. For community college instructors, what was really cool about this study is several of our students were community college students who transferred to the four-year institution and then talked about their community college experiences in the paper. And it's really interesting to see how they talk about navigating their experiences and almost kind of shifting their identities so that it matches with a new culture or a new context, even if it's within the same metropolitan area, and trying to refigure themselves and find out who they are again as a student in a different place.
Okay. We have a number of questions that are asking some kind of more specific questions about what the demographics were of your sample population and thinking about generalizations that you could make about different groups. Can you speak a little bit broadly about what the goal of qualitative research is compared to more quantitative research? Because I think often we think of quantitative research looking at broad patterns in the data in terms of this group underperforms on this exam, or this group has a higher, self-efficacy when we do this survey. Can you speak a little bit about what the goal of this study was in terms of this more qualitative work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the reasons why I wanted to handle this paper from a more qualitative perspective is to really dive deep into student stories and to get a much richer idea about why some of the phenomenon that we see whenever we zoom out to a broader scale is occurring. So like you said, Sarah, with quantitative papers, that we see, we usually see, broader strokes, like, students of this demographic typically had, like this many points and gain in some type of assessment. And the goal of the goal of at least my qualitative work, or the way I approach my qualitative work, is really understanding the mechanisms as to why that's occurring. So really understanding the culture of a particular institution, the histories of that institution, and the types of isms, I guess the best way that is to say, but the isms that undergird the social and cultural institutions of our particular context. So looking at, how does sexism manifest itself? How does classism, racism, etc.? Because all those things, even though all those things, we recognize that they're there, but because they are so commonly there, it's very invisible to us. So by being able to dive deeper into student quotes, student experiences, we're able to unveil those a little bit more and get a reason as to why we see trends that we see.
Yeah, I like to think about qualitative data as you're building theory, you're identifying kind of new interesting ideas, and in some cases it doesn't actually matter if only one student said something, it still could be a really important, interesting idea that then others could build upon and do more quantitative analyses later on. We had a couple questions that were a little bit more teacher focused or kind of instruction focused. So from your study, how can an instructor think about building science identity in the classroom among peers?
Yeah, so there are several ways to do it, and I see that and I see a variety of very positive things coming out in the literature as we progress. Some of the things that I've done, and granted, my context is a little bit different. My classes are smaller, but I have students actually write autobiographies for me. So at the beginning of the semester, I'm always curious as to why you're in my classroom. So they write these stories for me so that I have an understanding of who they are, their educational pathway, and what their goals, their aspirations are. And that's something that's been really rich to me. There's some of the things that students have told me in a larger context is that they really appreciate it when their instructor is vulnerable, sharing with them their educational pathway, their struggles as they went through it, because by sharing our stories, it also helps students make sense of their own and understands that there is more than one way to engage with science, that it's not just, getting an A on the exams that are given to you. And I think that that's really important. Other avenues that I've seen in the literature including assignments on diverse representation in the sciences. So I know that that's a lot of so I know Jeff Shinsky and his colleagues do the scientist spotlight, and I think that that's really important to have that representation. And another thing that I've been doing in my classes is trying to bring up history of science and seeing where science was, where science is going, and really getting students to engage with how we participated in science in the past, who was allowed to participate in science in the past, how that's changing, and what we can do to make the culture more inclusive and to make the culture more accessible.
Great. So we have a couple questions more specific to some of your specific findings that you have from the paper. Do you have any concrete examples of what students may have mentioned that were important experiences in the classroom that contribute or support their developing procedural science identity? Can you speak about some of the specific examples you found? And maybe refresh our memory about exactly what the difference between procedural science identity is and conceptual science identity?
Yeah, absolutely. So procedural identity production is going to be the performance. So these are going to be the ways in which students participate and engage in the classroom. And across the board, students really talked positively about the opportunities for scientific engagement that their instructors afforded to them. So they talked about, being able to talk in groups before answering clicker questions. They talked about being able to complete worksheets and assignments together, and really forming those bonds so that they can engage in science and with each other outside of the classroom as well. So students really talked about those explicit opportunities for engagement. And what these instructors did particularly well that students discussed also was saying why. So telling them why we're doing this. I think it's because whenever you're in a large lecture hall, it's very common to get students like, I paid money for this, I just want to be lectured at. And there's going to be some resistance to active learning and participation in groups. And these instructors, from what I gathered from the students, were very intentional. Like, I'm having you do this assignment together because X, Y, and Z. And students really like that transparency and seeing the rationale as to why. And that really helped with the buy-in in terms of why they engaged and why they participated.
Okay. A related question was specifically about the courses that you drew from at that institution. So to what extent did the courses you studied use some kind of pedagogical focus on identities? And did the salience of identities, did you notice any shift depending on the pedagogy used?
Oh, that's a great question. So identity was something that that we discussed in the paper, but it wasn't something explicitly that we were looking at with the larger project that the grant money came from. So the instructors, they knew that I was writing this paper on identity, but that's all they really knew. So I didn't give them any type of pedagogical recommendations around identity. Closer to the end of the paper, when we were putting on the final touches, we were starting to transition towards the HHMI grant at the institution. So at that point, I did talk to the instructors about some of the findings of this identity paper, and we were able to engage with, what students were feeling in their classroom and how they perceived the different experiences that they had. So I found that to be a pretty meaningful experience for the instructors to have the opportunity to see their students at a deeper level and to really get a chance to see how students felt in their classes. And I know that one instructor in particular really took this on and really started to focus on sense of belonging in the classroom and thinking about ways in which we can facilitate belonging and make students feel like you do care for them as, a whole person and not just necessarily a student ID that needs to get the content.
So because part of this, the goal is to kind of go behind the scenes, can you speak a little bit about what spurred this study? So what was your initial kind of inspiration? What motivated you to spend all this time and effort on this study? What jazzed you about it in the very beginning?
Yeah, so this is a funny story. It's really interesting. So I actually started off my PhD work with primarily quantitative work. So I was really interested in social network analysis. So one of the first things that I actually did was provide student surveys asking them who they interacted with and to rate the value of that interaction with that particular member of a classroom, whether it be a student, an LA, a TA, an instructor. And then from there, I realized that I wanted to get deeper into it. Why were some students valuing certain interactions over others? Why is it that someone was rated a 5 out of 5 and someone was rated a 1 out of 5? So I really started thinking about to think about ways in which we could gather that. So we gave out the classroom community scale in order to understand broader students' experiences in the classroom. And that data was just so interesting to see how students could feel so wildly different about, something that to one person looks exactly the same. Or how students can feel so wildly different about a very similar experience. And that's how I got into these interviews. And prior to all of this, I was already interested in looking at equity and inclusion issues in science education. So it felt like a natural lead-in. And my original thought was to do a mixed methods thing where we tie these interviews and surveys to a network analysis, but that didn't come to be, but that's just science.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit more about the author team and what were the different roles and kind of expertise and what people on the author team did? And can you talk a little bit about the timeline? How long did this project take, right? What was kind of the most onerous part of this project?
Yeah, so the author team was 4 individuals. Amreen was a graduate student at the same time I was, and she really helped out with the with interviewing students because 26 is quite a bit for one individual to go through. So we sat down to talk through how we would interview the students, what are the prompts that we would use, how would we try to elicit more information. So she helped me with the interview portion. And then Amreen and Leanne, who was a postdoc in our lab group, helped with the coding and really coming up with coding scheme, because even though we talked about mental and emotional self-making process and the performance and the participation, it was difficult, especially with the conceptual identity production, to really think about, okay, what do we mean by mental and emotional self-making? How does that actually manifest? So it was, lots and lots of conversations over, I have no clue, months, in order to get that, in order to really nail down what conceptual identity production looked like. That was the most fun to me, though. And Laurel, who was my advisor for my PhD program, she really helped me with getting figured worlds down to its essential components, because I really enjoyed learning about this theoretical framework, and I thought that it was so cool because it took into account that that emotional labor that we go through in order to produce an identity. And that was something that I felt like wasn't very common in the literature, so I really wanted to use it. And Laurel was so great at being able to help me break figured worlds down to its essential components so that it was more understandable. Like, okay, how can we use an example to contextualize it? How can we maybe change this term to another term that would be more accessible to practitioners and scholars who may not be as familiar to figured worlds? And that was probably the biggest stuff. And then whenever we had revisions, we'd go through as the team of four and talk about, okay, how can we reframe this to make this more accessible? What are ways in which we can reword it so that there's better flow?
You highlight in your paper a lot of different theories that could relate to identity. So how did you land on figured worlds and specifically Holland's theory?
Yeah. So I think that, I think that many of the identity theories out there are, very important. And a lot of them highlight the participatory aspect of identity production. So looking at, ways in which we engage in whatever classrooms we're in, context, engage in science. And I think that engagement is really important. One of the reasons why I brought in Dorothy Holland's figured worlds theory, though, is that I really wanted to dive beyond that participation. So thinking about, why we participate in the ways that we do. What were the histories that led to the ways in which we participate in the ways we do in the classroom and in science? And the figured worlds theory, I was drawn to it at first because it really pulled in a social and historical context. So a part of Dorothy Holland's work also built off of Bourdieu's social reproduction and looking at ways in which, we produce cultures from generation to generation, and our norms and our values, look very similar because of that, and how that, prevented people from being able to fully participate. And the way that Dorothy Holland talked about figured worlds made me see that from other aspects too. So what are the ways in which science culture may make it difficult for female students who are engaged in science, want to participate, and how do students of color end up participating based off of some of these historical and cultural structures that have been passed on from generation to generation. So Dorothy Holland's the theory really helped me grasp how institutionalized systems really work and how that affects the way we think and how we process through our stories and make sense of who we are. So that's one of the reasons why I was so drawn to figured worlds.
Great. I think your paper is a really great example of a paper in LSE that uses theory to really drive the project and to drive your interpretations of the results. Can you speak about kind of the importance of using theory in biology education research and kind of your advice for authors who are trying to figure out how to use theory and what that would mean?
Yeah. So Theoretical frameworks, to my perspective, are important because whenever you get a data set or whenever you're approaching a project, there are so many different perspectives, so many different angles in which you can approach it from. And theoretical frameworks really help you sharpen your focus and really ground yourselves into things that your data can and can't tell you, and help you organize your thoughts a little bit. Sometimes my thoughts go all over the place. So I think about, equity and inclusion, and I see more and more literature related to that in biology education, which I'm really happy about. And we can approach equity and inclusion from very different lenses and angles. You can look at institutionally what's happening at the institutional level. You could look at the individual lens. You can look at a classroom lens, historical lens, etc. So I really think that finding a theoretical framework that excites you also helps you focus a little bit so that you constrain yourself so that you're not being pulled in too many angles and end up getting yourself overwhelmed.
Okay. So this is a question that came in. We talked a little bit about how you could promote science identity, but this is kind of the converse question. What are common things that instructors or institutions could do that would invalidate student science identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I've noticed is this conception that a course is a weed out course, and I remember. Yeah, and I remember even my organic chemistry professor, whenever I took it, saying, this is the course where dreams go to die. And those were the words that she ended up using. And so I think that this elitism that some faculty members still hold may make students feel like they're not smart enough, or that they're not part of a science community, and that could really disengage students from science and make them leave. One of the other things that students told me about, particularly students of minoritized identities, is that they appreciate, thinking about diverse representation and making sure that we include examples, but also making sure that there's a seat at the table for students of minoritized identities. So making sure that there are female scientists and students at the table, scientists of color, students of color at the table, because some of the thoughts they had was they felt like in some cases it was very much a minority in display situation, where they felt like they were highlighting, scientists of minoritized identities without really giving them a voice, and centering their experiences and thinking about ways to move from just diversity, just having a lot of diverse students, to really thinking about equity and access and how we can make sure that these things are possible in a classroom.
Yeah, we have a number of questions that actually kind of piggyback on what you were just saying, thinking about specifically student identities related to kind of racial or ethnic identities and how that could influence their science identity productions. So can you speak based on your knowledge of the literature or your paper, would you advocate for different strategies for students with different kind of racial or ethnic identities? Do you think that because of their different experience in a culture in science that is primarily historically a white culture, how can we as instructors try to help these students form science identity, specifically thinking about our racial or ethnic underrepresented students?
Yeah, so one of the first things that came to mind was validating their experience. So just from my personal experience, students will come to office hours, they'll talk to me about what's happened to them in science so far. And I think really being able to lend an empathetic ear, I guess is the best way to put it, and really listen, not to respond, right? Listen to understand. And you don't really have to say much, but give them the opportunity to be able to express themselves, what they've experienced, and validate that. And I feel like that's a very important That's a very important first step. The second thing that I've seen in the literature is bring up injustices that have happened in science. I think that because of this notion of people, particularly people outside of science, as science as objective and acultural, that science can do no wrong, and we know that that's not the case, right? Whenever we think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, we may think about the eugenics movement. That there are places in history where science has failed, and I think that that's okay to be transparent about it and to discuss it in class as a way to show as a way to show ethical conundrums and what's happened, what are ways in which we're trying to improve ourselves, and what are ways in which we're still lacking. And I think that students really appreciate that candidness.
Yeah, so I think related to that question, we had a question come in. How do you think normalizing students struggling in their learning can help with science identity production?
I think that that's really important, and thank you for that question. One of the things that I do with my students is I talk about my educational pathway as well, because I don't even think Laurel or my lab knows this, but at one point I was thinking about becoming a Spanish teacher. I at one point did not think that I could go on in science, and I was looking at becoming a Spanish teacher, and so I am so whenever I share stories with my students, I talk about that. There are going to be days where you feel great, you feel like you're able to keep on going, you've made a huge contribution to your lab and you're really excited, and there are going to be days where you feel like I have no clue what I'm doing, and telling students, it's okay, right? It's okay to feel like you have no clue what you're doing. It's okay to drag your feet. So I absolutely agree that normalizing our failures and just realizing that we're also human and that we make mistakes is very important to helping our students out.
If you could go back in time and redo this study, knowing everything you know now, what would you do different?
Yeah, so it's one of those things where if we had unlimited money in the world, I would want more interviews. I think many of us would say that. One of the things that I've been more interested in recently is understanding students' progression over time and how their science identity changes over time. So recently, within like the past year and a half, we've had the opportunities to do some studies where we've had multiple interviews with students in different contexts. And I'm thinking about one right now in computer science, where it's so interesting to see what happens to them, going from year to year. How one year they may feel, super confident, and then another year they feel a little more beaten down and a little bit more invalidated. And I think that being able to understand student trajectories and how identities can change, right? Because identities are all about becoming. There's no fixed point that, this is the goal, this is what we want students to be. So identities are always changing, and being able to see these changes in these interviews and describe how these changes occurs, I think would be a really cool next step whenever we think about undergraduate biology students.
Yeah, a question I think on a lot of people's minds right now is how the COVID-19 pandemic and the transition for so many of our students to remote instruction and kind of often the impersonal nature of that. How do you think that's affected science identity production? And do you think that there's kind of long-term ramifications of this pandemic on who's going to end up participating in science in the future?
Yeah, I do think so, and that's an excellent question. All of these have been great questions. With COVID-19, one of the things that I've been trying to remind students, and I'm sure that many of us have had this at our institutions, where students fall off the map for a few weeks and then come back and then just profusely apologizing, like, I'm usually a better student than this, usually I'm more on top of my game. And I think giving them grace and being able to humanize students. Like, I know that if this were a regular semester, things would be different. I know that if you weren't trying to, do your own schooling and help your kids with your school, their schooling, that things would look different. So I think that being able to humanize students is really important, but it is very difficult. I know that students are feeling the burnout as we are on the instructional side as well. And I do fear that, particularly with students who are commonly, first generation, come from lower socioeconomic classes, students of color, we've seen reports that they missed out on this year, and that they missed out on this academic year, and depending on the economy being able to find work, they may not be back the following year, and it's difficult. I think that it showcases that it's not just an educational thing. I think that there are many things happening globally and happening nationally that are impacting it as well. And we just don't have the current infrastructure to help support these students, which is really disappointing to me.
Yeah, and I think we can think about this, so obviously we're in a time of crisis right now with the pandemic, but a lot of folks think that some kind of hybrid or online education is here to stay for the future, right? So, thinking about how online education can either promote or not promote, right, student science identity production, I think could be really interesting, right, for future work.
Yeah, and I think so too. And it'll be really interesting to see the papers that come out in the future around online learning and that production of a science identity. So looking at the ways in which they may, engage in discussion boards, or looking at the modalities in which we provide information to them. So do we have them, read text? Do we have them do simulations? Do we record lectures? So I agree. I'm very curious to see how online learning evolves as we go beyond the pandemic, but with the recognition that online learning is here to stay.
Yeah. So there was a question that came in that referenced some of the work that I've done in the past, looking at how active learning can potentially be problematic for students with marginalized identities, such as women or LGBTQ students or students with anxiety. Can you speak? So your study was contextualized in kind of active learning, pedagogy courses. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe some of the choices that instructors made could have either kind of helped their science identity or didn't help their science identity in terms of their specific active learning choices?
Yeah, so with that question, I agree with you. I think, students with anxiety, autism spectrum students, and additional minoritized identities, that it is difficult to be able to engage in group work whenever we think about active learning. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as we go into the pandemic is we've been thinking about the group work and group learning in a very singular way. We think about it, in a physical classroom, lecture hall, where, seats are able to turn around and we're able to talk to students. And what I've been thinking about with the pandemic is that that's not the only way to interact and to engage with other people. So one of the lessons that I hope that we bring back as we transition back, as more and more institutions transition back to in-person, is how do we want students to collaborate? Do we need them to collaborate in a space where they're physically facing one another? Some of the things that I've tried is, as we're doing discussions in classrooms, obviously there's the chat button on Zoom, and that's been students' best friends. I've also had Google Docs open so that students who may feel more anxious speaking out loud have the opportunity to share their thoughts in real time and type out what they're thinking in a Google Doc, and then we go over it. So I think that we have to almost reimagine what communication, what collaboration, what group works looks like, so that we can engage students in multiple modalities and they're still getting that rich experience of being able to hear other students' perspectives and feel like they're a part of a group in a larger classroom.
Yeah, I think that that's such an important point, especially thinking through like, why are we doing particular things, not just doing it because everyone else is doing it, and are there more creative, less anxiety provoking, right, less marginalizing potential options for those students, right? So, you know, and obviously people are really good at doing this with social media, doing a lot of online networking. I think a lot of instructors are not so great at building kind of community online, but we could learn from some of those other entities. And I think that that's also super important in thinking about science identity, right? So not all scientists have to be collaborative, right? So if you do really like working alone, you could still work alone, right? And I think that, that's something important to keep in mind. So we're running towards the kind of end of our time. So this will be kind of the final question. In your mind, what was the most surprising result of the study for you?
So with me, I think that, you know, just having grown up, being raised in the US and our educational system, I only have one experience. And this study was really interesting because we had international students. So, you know, some students from South Africa, Sudan, Pakistan, and being able to see and having them share their experiences about what education looked like when they were younger, what education looked like after they moved to the US, and how they navigated that was really fascinating to me, to think about the different ways in which education manifests itself in different countries and different contexts, and thinking about thinking about ways in which, oh, that was so cool, I can't believe that, you know, they took you all out to a rainforest and you got to learn ecology by IDing plants and animals out there. So that was one of the things that I really enjoyed, is being able to learn about different educational systems and contexts from our students.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for this kind of behind the scenes look at the paper. If you want to go ahead and share your slides, I think we'll ask all the participants to do just two quick things as an assessment for us. Could you go ahead and, using the chat feature, write down the one most interesting thing you learned during today's session? And then if you have any ideas for future papers published in LSE that you would like featured in this LSE Online, we would also like feedback on that. Okay, and as those ideas keep filtering in, we also want to highlight that the next session is Friday, May 7th. Dr. Brian Dewsbury and Cynthia Brame will be talking about evidence-based teaching guide on inclusive teaching. So hopefully folks can join that discussion to, again, get another behind the scenes look at how folks write these papers and do this research in LSE. And with that, I think that will wrap us up. Thank you, Ashante, for your help with all the logistics and setting up the webinar. Thank you to Jeff and Kimberly for the invitation for the session. And thank you, Paul, so much for all of your insights.
And thank you. This was an amazing opportunity to be able to share. So thank you, Sarah, for moderating. Thank you, Ashanti, Sharissa, Jeff, and Kimberly.